As Anna and the driver struggled to fix the tire of the bus in the middle of the dark road, green spots of light suddenly appeared from the snow-covered forest, like a mysterious and terrifying omen. Their eyes met in surprise, a feeling of unease rising as if something unpredictable was about to happen. For a moment, doubt crept into Anna's mind, making her wonder if moving to the quiet countryside had been a mistake. A few months ago, her mum had called her, sounding unusually serious. "Anna, listen," she said. "Your aunt's house is sitting empty. Why not give it a try?" She said, then added, "City life's not getting any easier for you." At first, the idea sounded crazy. Anna had spent her whole life in the chaos of the city, rushing to work, stuck in traffic, grabbing quick coffees with friends in noisy cafes. But the financial burden had become too much for her to bear. Rent kept rising, and her freelance work barely covered the bills. Gradually, the thought of leaving it all behind began to feel less like giving up, and more like an escape. Now, standing in the stillness of Maplewood, the silence was heavy, almost strange. The bus dropped her off at a lonely stop, and she carried her bags down a narrow, tree-lined road. When she saw the house, she stopped. It was small, tucked into a grove of tall trees, with its weathered shingles and a porch that sagged slightly under time's weight. Yet, it felt alive. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and the furniture, though old, was neatly arranged as if waiting for her. Anna wandered the rooms, running her fingers over the wooden banister and the faded wallpaper. It wasn't much, but it felt like it could be hers. The mornings in Maplewood were unlike anything Anna had known. The first time she woke up there, sunlight spilled through the thin curtains, casting golden patterns on the floor. Outside, a meadow stretched endlessly, the dew catching the light like scattered diamonds. She took her coffee to the porch and sat for hours, watching the breeze ripple through the grass. It wasn't the city's clamor, but it was something. Peaceful, soft, unhurried. Still, peace didn't pay the bills. Anna knew she needed a job. The village had a small general store, so she took a part-time position there. Her co-workers were polite but distant, and the tasks felt monotonous. Anna realized quickly that she didn't fit in, her city-bred habits clashing with the slower rhythms of the village. She decided to look for work in the nearest city, which was an hour away by bus. The job she found there was at a call center. Rows of cubicles lined the cavernous room, each one buzzing with the hum of voices and keyboard clicks. Anna was trained to read a script, dialing number after number to conduct surveys or offer promotions. It was tedious, but the paycheck was steady. That's where she met Ethan. Ethan was lanky with a crooked grin that seemed charming at first, but quickly lost its luster. "Hey, can you spot me $10?" he asked within their first conversation. Anna politely declined, but it became a pattern. Ethan had an uncanny knack for worming his way into people's good graces, and then their wallets. Anna kept her distance, sticking to her work and leaving promptly at the end of her shift. Maplewood, for all its beauty, could feel crushingly lonely. The villagers were kind, but kept to themselves, and Anna often spent her evenings alone. She'd sit by the small fireplace, trying to absorb the quiet, her thoughts louder than she liked. Slowly, she turned to books, learning new skills like sewing and gardening, anything to fill the hours. The isolation was heavy, but it shaped her. She grew more resilient, relying on herself in ways she never had to before. Time passed, and the house began to feel like home. Anna had started to replace the old curtains with ones she made herself and planted flowers in the garden. Each step was small, but it tethered her to the place. She still felt the pangs of solitude, the ache for someone to share it with, but the mornings kept her steady. The sun would rise, and so would she, ready to face whatever came next. Anna hurried down the dimly lit street, her breath visible in the cold evening air. She glanced at her watch, heart sinking as the realization set in. The bus was supposed to have passed 10 minutes ago. Just as she was about to resign herself to a long and uncertain wait, the faint rumble of an engine reached her ears. Headlights appeared in the distance, and relief washed over her. The bus, although delayed, had arrived. She stepped on, her boots clunking lightly against the metal steps. Chris, the driver, greeted her with a polite nod. "Evening," he said, his voice steady but low. His presence was calm, almost grounding, as though nothing in the world could shake him. With a brief glance, Anna noted his sharp features softened by the dim interior lights, and the quiet demeanor that seemed to envelop him in mystery. She muttered a "thank you" and moved further inside, noticing she was the only passenger. Settling into a seat near the window, Anna allowed herself a small sigh of relief. The familiar hum of the bus engine was oddly soothing after a long day at the garment factory. The journey stretched on in peaceful quiet until they entered a stretch of the countryside road, bordered by dense forest on both sides. Here, the streetlights disappeared, replaced by an eerie darkness, broken only by the headlights. Anna's eyelids grew heavy, her exhaustion catching up with her. Suddenly, the bus jolted violently, throwing her forward in her seat. She grabbed the back of the seat in front of her, heart racing. Chris brought the bus to a halt, muttering something under his breath as he unbuckled his seatbelt. "Flat tire," he said tersely, stepping out with a flashlight. The beam of light bobbed as he moved to the side of the bus. Anna hesitated for a moment, then followed, not wanting to be left alone in the dim interior. "You sure you want to come out here?" Chris asked, glancing over his shoulder. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried a hint of surprise. Anna shrugged, stepping onto the gravel. "I've handled worse," she replied, trying to mask her unease. The air was colder here, biting against her skin. Chris was already crouching near the back wheel, inspecting the damage. He sighed, running a hand through his short hair. "The spare's in the compartment, but it's going to take a while." He reached for a toolbox, his movements efficient, but showing a slight frustration. "Let me help," Anna said, her voice steady despite the nerves she felt creeping in. Chris paused, considering her for a moment. Then, with a small nod, he gestured to the tools. "All right, grab those wrenches and pass me the jack." Together, they worked in the dim glow of the flashlight, their breath forming small clouds in the icy air. Anna handed Chris tools while he loosened the bolts, their movements syncing as though they'd done this before. The quiet between them was comfortable, broken only by the occasional instruction or grunt of effort. It was an unspoken partnership, born out of necessity, but strangely fitting. When the wheel was finally removed and the spare tire ready, Chris stood, stretching his back with a wince. "Thanks," he said, his tone softer now. Before Anna could respond, a strange glow from the trees nearby caught her attention. It was faint at first, just a flicker of greenish-blue light, but it quickly grew brighter. She froze, her eyes locked on the source. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the stillness of the forest. Chris turned, following her gaze. The light shimmered through the branches, pulsing almost like a heartbeat. He stepped closer to Anna, shielding her slightly. The two of them stood there, rooted to the spot, as the glow seemed to intensify. The quiet hum of the forest grew heavier, almost oppressive, as though something was holding its breath. Chris tightened his grip on the wrench in his hand, his gaze fixed on the strange phenomenon. "Get back in the bus," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. Anna hesitated, glancing between him and the light. "What about you?" "I'll handle it," Chris replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Just stay inside." Anna reluctantly nodded, stepping back toward the open door. But before she climbed in, she glanced back one last time, her heart pounding with an unshakable feeling that this night was far from over. The forest was eerily quiet until the first haunting howl shattered the stillness. From the shadows, pairs of green eyes glowed, piercing through the night like embers against the darkness. One by one, large wolves emerged, their movements slow and deliberate, surrounding the stopped bus. Their sheer size was enough to make Anna's breath hitch. Beside her, Chris tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the tension in his shoulders betraying the calm tone he tried to project. "They're probably just curious," he said, glancing at Anna briefly. "Wild animals get intrigued by things out of place." But his eyes darted back to the wolves, scanning the growing circle around them. His jaw clenched as he muttered under his breath, "Stay calm." Anna nodded, but couldn't stop her hands from trembling. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, as if the fabric could shield her from the wolves. The eerie howling continued, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It echoed through the trees, wrapping around them like a suffocating fog. The wolves didn't lunge or growl. They simply stood, observing, their glowing eyes unblinking. Chris reached over and turned the key, but the engine only sputtered. He swore under his breath, then leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "The battery's dead, and I didn't finish the tire." The wolves showed no signs of aggression, but their presence was unnerving. Anna's voice wavered. "Why are they just watching?" Chris didn't answer immediately. He scanned the scene, his mind racing. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "It's not normal. They're waiting for something." They exchanged a glance, both realizing that waiting inside the bus wouldn't solve their problem. The flat tire was still there, a tangible reminder that escape wasn't an option until it was fixed. Chris inhaled deeply, his resolve hardening. "I need to finish changing the tire." Anna's eyes widened. "Are you serious? What if they attack?" Chris met her gaze, his expression steady. "They haven't so far. If they wanted to, they'd have done it already. I think they're here for a reason." Anna hesitated, fear gripping her, but she saw the determination in his face. Slowly, she nodded. "All right, but I'm coming with you." Chris opened the door cautiously, the cold air rushing in. He stepped out first, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The wolves didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, they seemed to adjust their positions slightly, maintaining their silent vigil. Anna followed him, clutching her coat tightly, her breath visible in the icy night. Chris crouched by the damaged tire, his hands moving quickly to resume where he had left off. The lug wrench felt cold and unyielding in his grip. "Hand me the smaller jack," he said over his shoulder. Anna hurried to gather the scattered tools, her fingers trembling as she placed them into the box. She kept glancing nervously at the wolves, half expecting them to move closer. "They're not even growling," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wrench. "It's like they're waiting." Chris grunted as he tightened the last bolt. "Whatever they're waiting for, I'd rather not find out. Let's just focus on getting this done." Despite her fear, Anna tried to stay useful. She picked up discarded tools and packed them away, keeping her movements careful and deliberate. Her heart raced with every passing second, but she refused to let panic consume her. Chris glanced up briefly, his lips curling into a small, appreciative smile. "You're doing great," he said softly, his tone steady. It was a brief moment of calm amidst the chaos. As Chris worked on the tire, a low, guttural growl rumbled from the forest, distant but unmistakable. Both of them froze. Anna's eyes darted toward the source of the sound, but the wolves surrounding them didn't react. Instead, they remained in their places, their focus still on the bus. Chris straightened slowly, his gaze flickering between the wolves and the trees beyond. "Almost done," he muttered, more to himself than to Anna. His hands moved faster, the adrenaline giving him an edge. The new tire was in place, and he tightened the bolts with practiced precision. Anna stood close, her body tense, ready to bolt back into the bus at the slightest provocation. Finally, Chris stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It's done," he said, his voice low but firm. Relief washed over Anna's face, but before she could say anything, a single wolf stepped forward. It was larger than the others, its fur a sleek, dark grey that shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Its eyes locked onto Chris's, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The wolf didn't snarl or bare its teeth. It simply stared, its presence commanding, almost regal. Chris felt a strange pull, an inexplicable urge to understand. Anna tugged at his sleeve. "Chris, get back in the bus," she urged, her voice barely steady. Chris didn't move. "Wait," he said softly. The wolf tilted its head slightly, as if trying to communicate. Then, with deliberate slowness, it turned and began walking toward the trees. It paused after a few steps, looking back at Chris, its eyes shining with an almost human intelligence. "It wants me to follow," Chris said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Anna's grip tightened on his sleeve. "You can't. It's too dangerous." Chris met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I'll be careful. Lock the door behind me. I'll be back." Before Anna could protest further, Chris took a hesitant step forward. The wolf didn't flee. It waited, then continued walking, leading Chris into the shadowed forest. Anna stood frozen by the bus, her heart pounding as she watched him disappear into the trees. The air was so cold, it bit into Chris's skin as he stepped down from the bus, gripping the flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. Snow crunched beneath his boots, each step slow and deliberate. The wolves had fallen silent, their howls replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed almost louder than sound. The only noise was the faint rustling of branches overhead and the occasional puff of Chris's breath, visible in the frosty air. Anna watched him from the cracked open bus door, her face pale, her fingers clutching the edge of the seat. "Chris, don't do this," she called softly, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's not safe." He glanced back briefly. "I won't go far. I'll be fine," he assured her, though his heart pounded hard in his chest. He couldn't quite explain the pull he felt toward the wolf that had stepped forward earlier. It wasn't just its piercing green eyes, filled with something almost human. It was the sound, the faint, desperate whimper that had floated from the darkness like a plea for help. The large wolf stood a few yards ahead, its massive form silhouetted against the snow-covered forest. Its breath came out in short bursts, visible in the moonlight. Chris took another step, and the wolf moved, turning its head toward the dark forest beyond, as if signaling him to follow. The wolf padded forward, its movements fluid and calm. It paused occasionally, looking back to ensure Chris was still following. The snow beneath Chris's feet grew deeper as he left the road, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the dense trees. Then Chris heard it again, that faint, almost imperceptible sound. It wasn't a growl or a bark, it was a whimper, a sound of pain and distress. He stopped, straining to listen. The wolf ahead of him froze too, lifting its head and tilting it slightly, as if to confirm what Chris had just heard. The whimper came again, louder this time. Chris quickened his pace, his flashlight catching glimpses of movement. The large wolf led him deeper into the woods, where the snow seemed untouched by human feet. Then, suddenly, the beam of light landed on a scene that made Chris's breath catch in his throat. Beneath a heavy fallen tree, a smaller wolf lay pinned, its front leg trapped under the massive trunk. Blood stained the snow around it, stark against the pure white. The wolf's chest rose and fell rapidly, its amber eyes wide with fear and pain. Chris froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. The larger wolf stepped closer to the trapped one, letting out a soft whine as it nuzzled the injured wolf's head. Then it turned to Chris, locking eyes with him once more. The urgency in its gaze was impossible to ignore. Chris swallowed hard, pushing down the fear rising in his chest. He didn't know much about wolves, but he knew enough to realize this was dangerous. Still, he couldn't just walk away. He knelt down a few feet away from the injured animal, setting his flashlight on the ground so its beam illuminated the scene. "Okay," he said softly, more to himself than the wolves. "Let's figure this out." The fallen tree was massive, its bark rough and frozen with snow and ice. Chris tested its weight with the crowbar, but it didn't budge. He repositioned himself, gripping the tool tighter, and tried again. His muscles strained as he put his entire body into the effort. The tree shifted slightly, but didn't lift. Frustrated, Chris let out a heavy breath and wiped his forehead with the back of his gloved hand. "Come on," he muttered, resetting his stance. This time, he planted his feet more firmly in the snow and pushed with everything he had. The tree groaned, and for a moment, Chris thought it might be enough. It wasn't. The trunk settled back into place, as immovable as ever. Chris straightened up, panting, his breath clouding the air in front of him. He glanced back at the larger wolf, which stood a few feet away, watching him intently. The injured wolf whimpered again, and Chris clenched his jaw. "I'm not giving up," he said aloud, his voice firm. He adjusted his grip and tried again, this time using the crowbar as leverage against a rock beneath the tree. Slowly, painstakingly, the tree began to shift. Chris gritted his teeth, his muscles screaming in protest. Finally, with one last heave, the trunk rolled just enough to free the wolf's leg. Chris stumbled back, nearly falling into the snow. The injured wolf scrambled to its feet, limping heavily but free. The larger wolf rushed to its side, sniffing it anxiously before licking the injured leg. Chris sat back on his heels, his chest heaving. He watched as the two wolves exchanged what could only be described as a silent conversation. Then, almost as one, they turned their eyes to him. The larger wolf dipped its head slightly, almost like a nod of thanks, before leading the injured one back into the trees. For a long moment, Chris remained where he was, staring after them. The snow fell softly around him, muffling the sounds of the forest. Finally, he picked up his flashlight and crowbar, his hands trembling slightly. When he made his way back to the bus, Anna was waiting for him, her face tight with worry. She jumped to her feet as soon as he appeared. "What happened? Are you okay?" Chris nodded, still catching his breath. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was rough. He climbed into the bus, shutting the door behind him, and sank into the driver's seat. Anna studied him for a moment, then glanced out the window toward the woods. "What did you see?" Chris hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I helped," he said finally. "That's all that matters." He turned the key, and the engine roared to life, breaking the stillness of the night. The bus rattled back to life as Chris turned the key in the ignition. For a moment, the rumble of the engine was the only sound breaking the heavy silence between him and Anna. Chris finally broke the quiet, his voice calm, but weighted. "It was the strangest thing," he began, his gaze fixed on the steering wheel as if replaying the moments in his mind. "That wolf, she was stuck under a tree, her leg pinned, bleeding, but she didn't thrash, just looked at me like she knew I'd help." He paused, rubbing his hands together as if the memory had chilled him anew. And then the pack. They didn't act like wolves should. They waited, didn't threaten me, almost. Respected what I was doing. Anna turned slightly in her seat, her eyes fixed on him now. She said nothing, letting him speak. Chris glanced at her and continued, "I don't know why I followed that wolf, but it felt right, like it was calling me, not just for help, but for something more." When I freed her, the way they all looked at me, it wasn't just relief or gratitude, it was like they understood. Anna absorbed every word, her brows furrowing slightly as she tried to imagine the scene. She had seen Chris walk into the dark without hesitation, and now hearing the story, a flicker of admiration grew. "You've got guts," she finally said, her tone soft yet firm. Most people would have stayed in the bus, waited it out, hoped for the best. But you went into the unknown for them. Chris chuckled lightly, his face softening for the first time that night. "Maybe I'm just stupid," he said, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Anna shook her head. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "It takes heart to do what you did. You didn't have to, but you chose to." By the time they reached the edge of the village, a quiet understanding had settled between them. Chris pulled the bus to a halt in front of Anna's home, the small wooden house standing quaintly under the faint glow of the porch light. As she stood to leave, Anna noticed a tear along the sleeve of Chris's jacket, the fabric frayed and stained with mud. "Your jacket," she said, pointing at the rip. Chris glanced at it and shrugged. "Ah, it's seen worse," he replied, brushing it off. But Anna lingered by the open door of the bus, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag. "I could fix it for you," she offered after a moment. "It won't take long. I've got a sewing kit inside." Her voice was casual, almost too casual, but her gaze held his, steady and unflinching. Chris hesitated, his hand hovering over the steering wheel as if considering whether to refuse. But there was something sincere in her tone, something that made him nod. "All right," he said simply, stepping out of the bus. Inside, Anna's house was warm, lit by the soft glow of a single overhead lamp. The living room was small but inviting, with a patchwork quilt draped over a worn couch and a simple wooden table in the corner. Chris stood awkwardly by the doorway as Anna disappeared into another room, returning with a small box of needles and thread. "Here, sit," she said, pulling out a chair for him at the table. Chris obliged, shrugging off his jacket and handing it to her. She worked quickly but carefully, her hands steady as she stitched the tier. Chris watched her in silence for a moment, the rhythmic motion of her hands oddly soothing. "You're good at this," he remarked, his voice breaking the quiet. Anna glanced up briefly, a faint smile on her lips. "Picked it up as a kid," she replied. "Didn't have much, so we made do. Guess it stuck." As the thread looped and pulled through the fabric, their conversation shifted to lighter topics. They talked about their work, the quirks of small-town life, and even shared a few stories from their pasts. The tension from earlier had dissipated, replaced by an easy camaraderie that felt natural, unforced. When Anna finished, she held up the jacket, inspecting her work. "There," she said, handing it back to him. "Good as new." Chris slipped it on, flexing his arm to test the repair. "Looks like it'll hold up," he said, giving her an appreciative nod. "Thanks, Anna." "You didn't have to do that." She shrugged, her smile warm but understated. "Couldn't let you walk around looking like you wrestled a bear, could I?" Chris laughed, the sound filling the small room. As he stood to leave, he hesitated for a moment, his gaze lingering on her. "You know," he said, his tone softer now, "I think tonight's the first time in a long while I've felt connected to something. To someone." Anna met his eyes, her smile fading into something more genuine, more sincere. "Me too," she said quietly. Chris nodded, the silence between them speaking volumes. "Good night, Anna," he said finally, his voice carrying a warmth that matched the room. "Good night, Chris," she replied as he stepped out into the cool night air, the door clicking softly behind him. Chris started coming by Anna's house more often after that strange night with the wolves. At first, his visits were casual. He would pass by on his route, stopping to check if she needed anything from town or to chat briefly about the weather. But as days turned into weeks, his visits grew longer, and he began helping her with small tasks around the house. There was always something that needed fixing in Anna's modest little home. The back gate creaked and wouldn't shut properly, the kitchen faucet dripped endlessly, and the wooden steps leading to the front porch had grown uneven and unsafe. Chris fixed each of these with the quiet, steady competence that defined him, refusing any offers of payment or even a cup of coffee until the job was done. One afternoon, as Chris was patching a leak in the roof, Anna brought him a cold drink. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and smiled at her in that understated way she was beginning to recognize as his. "You've got quite the knack for keeping busy," she said, handing him the glass. "Well," he replied with a shrug, "it keeps me out of trouble. Besides, you shouldn't have to do all this on your own." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, and then Chris started talking about his childhood. He told her about growing up in a small Baltic village with harsh winters and summers that felt far too short. His grandmother, who had raised him after his parents passed away, was a strong, stubborn woman who loved telling old folk tales by the fire. Anna listened intently, picturing a younger version of Chris in the stories he shared, and when he paused, she found herself opening up about her own life. She told him about the bustling city she'd left behind and the career she had dreamed of, before her plans unraveled. She explained how the unexpected inheritance of her aunt's house had felt like a second chance, an escape from the overwhelming pace of the city and a chance to figure out what she really wanted. As she spoke, Chris nodded, his quiet attention making her feel understood in a way she hadn't felt in years. Then, without warning, Chris reached over and took her hand in his. His fingers were calloused but warm, and Anna looked up, surprised. Chris's eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The sincerity in his expression was unmistakable, and Anna felt a rush of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she smiled. A quiet, tender smile that said more than words ever could. From that evening onward, something between them shifted. Chris's visits became a regular part of Anna's days, and their connection grew deeper with each passing week. They spent more time together, not just fixing things or sharing stories, but enjoying the simple routines of life in the village. Chris would help her gather firewood or shovel snow, and Anna would show him how to bake bread or tend to the small garden she had started in the spring. The villagers, who had grown used to seeing Chris's bus parked outside Anna's house, began to notice the change in the way they looked at each other. There was a warmth and ease in their interactions that hadn't been there before, and it wasn't long before the whispers started. But Anna and Chris paid no attention to the talk. Their world had narrowed to the quiet moments they shared, and that was all that mattered. One morning, as the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Chris arrived at Anna's house with a small wooden box in his hands. Inside was a pair of handcrafted birdhouses he had built himself. "For your garden," he said simply, placing them on the kitchen table. Anna ran her fingers over the smooth wood, touched by the care and detail he had put into them. "Chris," she began, her voice soft, "I don't know what to say." "Just say you'll keep letting me stick around," he replied, with a crooked grin. Anna laughed, a sound that felt light and free, and she realized she hadn't laughed like that in a long time. She nodded, and as their eyes met, the understanding between them deepened. They didn't need to say the words aloud. It was clear that whatever they were building together was as strong and steady as the birdhouses Chris had made. In the weeks that followed, they continued to share their lives piece by piece, building something neither of them had expected, but both deeply cherished. It wasn't a grand, sweeping romance, but a quiet, steadfast love that fit the rhythm of their days in the village. Together, they began to imagine a future that felt as solid and comforting as the home they had started to make together. The wedding had been modest, but heartfelt, a quiet ceremony in the village surrounded by a handful of neighbors and friends. The simplicity suited Anna and Chris perfectly. Now, as they stood in the doorway of the small house Anna had inherited, the future felt wide open. The house wasn't much, a two-bedroom structure with weathered wooden walls and a roof that had seen better days, but to them, it was everything. Over the following weeks, the couple set to work. The first task was cleaning. Years of disuse had left the house coated in a layer of dust. Armed with buckets, rags, and a shared determination, Anna and Chris scrubbed every surface until the wood gleamed. They laughed at the cobwebs in corners and discovered old trinkets that hinted at her aunt's life. She must have loved birds, Anna said, holding up a porcelain sparrow she found tucked in a kitchen cabinet. Chris nodded, placing the figurine carefully on the windowsill where sunlight streamed in. Their efforts didn't stop at cleaning. They painted the walls a warm cream color, the scent of fresh paint mingling with the crisp country air that floated through the open windows. Outside, Chris dug into the earth with a rusted shovel to create a flower bed, while Anna planted bulbs and seeds. Each evening, they stood on the porch, admiring their progress as dusk painted the sky. It was hard work, but it brought them closer. By the time they hung curtains and placed the last chair in the corner, the house didn't just look like a home. It felt like one. Life settled into a steady rhythm, but it didn't stay quiet for long. One warm morning, a man arrived in the village wearing a crisp grey suit that seemed out of place against the rustic backdrop. He introduced himself as Mr. Carter, a representative of a major real estate company, and wasted no time announcing the company's plans. They intended to buy large tracts of land in the area, with the goal of transforming the peaceful village into a luxury resort destination. The news swept through the village like wildfire. Some villagers were intrigued, tempted by the promise of money. "Think of the opportunities," Mrs. Baxter, the baker, said over her stall at the weekly market. "We could finally replace that old oven of mine." Others, however, were appalled. "This isn't just land," Mr. Hargrove, the farmer, argued at the pub that evening. "It's our way of life." Anna and Chris couldn't help but feel caught in the middle. They valued the tranquility of the village, but couldn't deny the allure of financial stability, especially after the cost of renovating their home. Chris tried to focus on his job, driving the local bus, but the debates buzzed in his ears as passengers discussed the proposal endlessly. Anna spent her days sewing, her thoughts spinning as she listened to conflicting opinions during her visits to the market. Things came to a head at a town meeting held in the village hall, where residents gathered to hear more about the development plans. Mr. Carter stepped up to the podium, his voice smooth as he detailed the company's vision. But it wasn't Carter who drew Anna's attention. It was the man standing beside him, Ethan. Ethan was a face Anna hadn't seen in years, but she recognized him immediately. Back in her call center days, Ethan had been the co-worker everyone warned her about. Charming but self-serving, he was always borrowing money or shirking responsibilities. Now, here he was, confidently presenting slides and statistics as though he belonged at the helm of a corporate boardroom. "Anna, is that you?" Ethan's eyes lit up when their gazes met after the meeting ended. He strolled over with the same breezy confidence she remembered. "What a small world," he said, extending his hand to Chris. "And you must be her husband." Chris shook Ethan's hand, his grip firm, but his expression guarded. "Chris," he said shortly. Ethan ignored the cold tone and launched into a story about how he had climbed the corporate ladder. His words were laced with flattery and reminiscing, but Anna could see through it. Ethan hadn't changed. He was still looking for ways to serve his own interests. Later, that evening, Ethan approached Anna and Chris outside the hall. He leaned in conspiratorially, his voice dropping. "I can help you guys out," he said. "Sell the land, take the money, and move back to the city. You don't belong here anyway, Anna. Remember how much you hated village life when we used to talk at work?" Anna's face hardened. "That was a long time ago," she said evenly. "Things have changed." Ethan smirked, his confidence undeterred. Sure, but think about it. You could make enough to live comfortably, maybe even start that design business you used to talk about. Staying here? That's just holding you back." Chris stepped forward, his eyes steady. "We're happy where we are." Ethan's tone shifted, growing sharp. "I'm just saying, the village is going to change whether you like it or not. If you sell now, you'll be ahead of the curve. Refuse, and you might find yourselves on the wrong side of things. People don't take kindly to holdouts." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air as Ethan turned and walked away, leaving Anna and Chris standing in the cool night. The weight of his words pressed heavily on them, but as they walked home hand in hand, neither spoke. It wasn't fear that kept them quiet, but a shared resolve to protect what they had built. The road ahead would not be easy, but they knew one thing for sure. Their home was worth fighting for. Chris parked the bus at the far edge of the village, the engine rumbling to a low purr before he turned it off. He leaned back in his seat for a moment, gazing out at the dim horizon where the sun was beginning to set. The golden-orange glow stretched across the sky, casting long shadows over the narrow road that led back to their little house. He could already see Anna in his mind, standing by the window, her hands busy stitching some new creation. That thought alone was enough to shake off the fatigue of another long day behind the wheel. It had been 3 weeks since the meeting in the village hall, where Anna and Chris had stood firm against the smooth-talking Ethan. Anna's voice had been steady, but unyielding as she addressed the crowd. "This house isn't just a piece of property," she'd said. "It's where Chris and I have built our life. It's where we belong." Ethan had smirked at first, but the villagers had begun to listen. Chris had joined her, speaking not with Anna's eloquence, but with a quiet sincerity that carried weight. "It's more than money," he had added. "It's about what kind of place we want this to be, not just for us, but for everyone who lives here." The tide had shifted that evening. Over the following days, Anna and Chris had visited neighbors, talked with the elders, and shared stories about why keeping the land as it was mattered so deeply. It wasn't easy, but bit by bit, the resistance grew into unity. Ethan had left, defeated but not without muttering threats of future development plans. The village had reclaimed its voice, and Anna and Chris had been at the heart of it. Now, life had returned to its usual rhythm. Chris worked his shifts on the bus, driving the familiar routes that wound through the forests and fields. The mornings were quiet, passengers subdued as they began their days. The evenings, however, were lonelier. On the final trips back, when the seats were often empty and the stars just starting to peek through the canopy of trees, his thoughts drifted back to Anna. She had taken to selling her handcrafted items at the market in the village square. Her skills with needle and thread had grown into a small business. While the earnings weren't enough to call it prosperity, there was a steady trickle of income that brought her joy. Every evening, Anna would recount her day at the market, the customers she'd met, and the stories they'd shared. Chris loved the way her face lit up when she talked about her work, the passion that drove her even when sales were slow. It was on one of those late-night drives that the wolves appeared again. Chris had nearly forgotten about them after all the weeks of silence. The first time he noticed them, it was just a fleeting glance, a shadowy form keeping pace with the bus. He slowed down slightly, peering out the window. The wolves emerged, one by one, running alongside the vehicle as if escorting him home. Chris never felt fear in those moments, only a strange calm. Their presence was almost reassuring, a reminder of that strange night when he had followed one of them into the forest. The wolves didn't come close, didn't linger. They simply stayed near, silent and watchful. until the bus rolled into the village and the engine stilled. When Chris got home that evening, Anna was waiting for him in the kitchen. A pot of tea was steeping on the counter, and the scent of lavender filled the room. She looked up from her sewing when he stepped in, her smile warm and welcoming. "Was it a quiet run?" she asked, pouring him a cup. Chris hesitated, then chuckled softly as he sat down across from her. "The wolves showed up again," he said, shaking his head. Anna paused, her needle hovering mid-air. "Again?" "They ran with the bus, like before," he explained, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know what it is about them, but it doesn't feel bad, you know? It's like they're just there." Anna set her sewing aside, folding her hands on the table. "Maybe they feel connected to you after what happened with the she-wolf," she mused. "It's strange, but maybe it's their way of saying thank you." Chris shrugged, not entirely sure what to make of it. "Maybe. It's not something I'll ever understand." The financial struggles of adapting to life in the village had tested their relationship in ways neither had expected. There were days when Anna felt overwhelmed by the slow pace of her business, and Chris struggled with the monotony of his job. Arguments broke out over small things: misplaced tools, forgotten errands, the bills that always seemed to pile up faster than they could pay them, but they had learned to navigate these challenges together. Chris had a way of calming Anna when her frustration bubbled over, reminding her of all the progress she had made and the community she was building through her work. Anna, in turn, kept Chris grounded, helping him see the beauty in their simple life and the importance of what they were creating together. The next morning, Chris stood in the doorway with his thermos of coffee and his lunchbox, ready for another day on the road. Anna waved him off, standing in the garden with her hands stained from the herbs she had been tending. As the bus disappeared down the road, she turned back toward the house, thinking of the future. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and they had the land that had become their home. That, Anna thought, was more than enough. Thank you for being here and listening to Anna and Chris's story. It's a beautiful tale of love, resilience, and standing together through life's challenges. Their bond and the quiet strength they showed in protecting their home and their way of life left a lasting impression. The wolves, silently watching and running alongside Chris, were such a striking image. There's something powerful about their presence, almost as if they understood the connection between the land and the people who cared for it. Was there a moment in the story that stood out to you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for being a part of this space, and I'll see you in the next story.